One of the hardest truths to accept about life is that no matter how carefully you live, no matter how many good intentions you carry, you will eventually become the villain in someone's story. That is not because you are malicious by nature, but because human beings are creatures of perspective. We don't see each other as we are. We see each other through a lens, filter of our own experiences, wounds, and expectations. And those filters can distort even your best efforts into something harmful or cruel in the eyes of another. Right? Think about it. You could make a decision today that you believe is responsible, even loving, and yet someone else might experience that same decision as betrayal or indifference. You could set a boundary because you need to protect your own mental health. And the other person might interpret that as rejection or hostility. You could speak honestly and someone might call you harsh. You could stay silent and someone else might accuse you of being cold. The very same action can be read in opposite ways, depending on who is watching and what story they've already written in their mind. This is why it's impossible to live in such a way that you are seen as good by everyone. Human perception doesn't work that way. Each person carries their own private narrative, their own pain, their own assumptions, and those shape how they interpret you. If someone has been abandoned in the past, your distance might reopen that wound. If someone has been betrayed before, your honesty might look like manipulation. And if someone has been overlooked, your silence might feel like another confirmation that they don't matter. In other words, you don't encounter people as blank slates. You encounter them not as layered beings whose histories color the way they see you. And it's worth asking, how often do you do the same? How often do you cast someone in the role of the villain in your own story? Maybe they didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe they were doing their best under difficult circumstances. Maybe they simply saw the situation differently. But in your memory, in your story, they are the bad one. We do this constantly, usually without realizing it. And that should humble us, because if we do it to others so easily, why would we assume others aren't doing the same to us? This realization can feel uncomfortable, even unfair. We want to believe that if we just act with kindness, if we're thoughtful enough, careful enough, nobody will ever misunderstand us. But that's a dangerous illusion, because no matter how carefully you walk, you will still step on someone's wounds. And the danger of believing otherwise is that you'll spend your life trying to appease every possible perspective, bending yourself into shapes that don't reflect who you really are. That's not integrity, that's performance. And performances may win applause for a while, but they leave you hollow. So what do you do with this truth? You start by accepting it. You acknowledge that being the villain in someone else's story is not only possible, but inevitable. And once you accept that, something remarkable happens. You begin to feel freer. You stop chasing the impossible dream of universal approval. You stop wasting energy on trying to control every perception. Instead, you turn your focus inward toward living honestly and responsibly, regardless of how it is misinterpreted. But don't misunderstand me here. This isn't an excuse for cruelty or negligence. It's not a license to hurt people carelessly and then shrug it off by saying, well, I'm just bad in their story. No, it's about balance. It's about recognizing that even when you act with integrity, even when you try your best, some people will still cast you in a role you didn't choose. And you cannot spend your life chasing down every misunderstanding to fix it. You won't win that battle. Instead, your task is to live in such a way that, despite the inevitable misperceptions, you can stand before yourself and say, I did what I believed was right. I acted from conscience, not from fear of opinion. And here's the deeper truth. Sometimes being seen as bad by someone is the price you pay for doing what is good. When you set boundaries, when you speak honestly, when you refuse to participate in destructive patterns, someone will resent you for it. To them, you'll be the villain. But in reality, you may have been acting out of strength, out of necessity, out of care for the greater good. That's why you must be careful about measuring your worth by the stories others tell about you. Those stories reflect their perspective, not necessarily the truth. So if you take nothing else from this, take this: you cannot control the role you play in everyone else's story. You can only control the role you play in your own. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is to accept being misunderstood, even hated, because you refuse to betray your own integrity just to appear good in someone else's eyes. And that's the paradox. You will be bad in someone's story, but that doesn't make you bad. It makes you, if we've already established that we are destined not to be the villain in someone's story because of perspective, then the next step is even more difficult. Realizing that sometimes we actually are the villain, not just in someone else's perception, but in reality. And the reason is simple. Every single one of us carries a shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as the part of ourselves we do not wish to see, the impulses we repress, the flaws we deny, the selfishness we justify. We tend to imagine ourselves as fundamentally good, or at least neutral, but the truth is we are capable of cruelty, dishonesty, envy, and malice. Often we hurt others not by accident, but because we are careless, self-absorbed, or unwilling to face our own darkness. And if you think you're immune from that, you're lying to yourself. Because the moment you convince yourself you're entirely good, you become blind to the damage you cause. Think of how easy it is to justify your behavior when you're angry, or when you're hurt, or when you believe you've been treated unfairly. In those moments, you may lash out. You may say words you know will cut deeply. You may withhold affection, twist the truth, or act out of pride. And at the time, you convince yourself it's justified, that you had no choice, that they deserved it, that you were only defending yourself. But from the other side, what they experience is betrayal, cruelty, or neglect. That's not just a matter of perception. That's your shadow at work. And this is where responsibility comes in. Because you can't grow if you refuse to acknowledge the darker parts of your nature. You can't evolve by pretending your shadow doesn't exist. It's there whether you like it or not. The question is whether you're willing to confront it. Are you willing to look honestly at the ways you manipulate, the ways you avoid responsibility, the ways you hurt people you claim to love? That confrontation is painful, but without it, you remain stuck in the illusion of your own goodness, an illusion that prevents you from genuine maturity. It's easier to believe that all the villains are out there somewhere. Other people, toxic people, the unjust, the cruel, the selfish. But if you look closely, you'll see those same tendencies in yourself. You might not like them, and you might not want to admit them, but they live inside you all the same. Jung once said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Why terrifying? Because to accept yourself, you have to accept that you are not only capable of great kindness, but also of great harm. You are not only a hero in some stories, you are the villain in others, and sometimes with good reason. This is not meant to be paralyzing. In fact, it's liberating, because once you accept your shadow, you stop being controlled by it. You become more careful with your words, more thoughtful with your actions, more humble in your judgments. You realize that if you are capable of being bad, then you must remain vigilant about how you live. And that vigilance is what keeps you honest. Let me give you an example. Imagine a parent who loves their child deeply, but in moments of stress, lashes out yelling harsh words. The parent convinces themselves it's discipline, but in truth, it's anger they've failed to master. The child remembers not discipline, but fear. In the parent's story, they are simply doing their best. In the child's story, they are the villain. And the parent cannot reconcile this until they acknowledge their own shadow, their capacity for anger, for carelessness, for harm. Without that acknowledgement, the cycle continues. This is why humility is so important. Humility doesn't mean weakness. It means you recognize the limits of your goodness. It means you understand that you are always a work in progress, and that part of being human is facing the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. When you do that, you gain not only honesty, but also compassion. Because if you see your own shadow clearly, you're far less likely to judge others harshly. You know how easy it is to fail because you've seen your own failures up close. And here's where this connects back to the bigger theme. If you are inevitably bad in someone's story because of perspective, then acknowledging your shadow is admitting that sometimes those stories are accurate. You weren't misunderstood, you actually failed. You hurt someone, you were careless or selfish or blind. And when that's the case, the only way forward is not denial, but responsibility. You can't rewrite the past, but you can take ownership of your actions, learn from them, and commit to doing better. This, in the end, is what separates growth from stagnation. Denying your shadow leaves you stuck, repeating the same mistakes, blind to the harm you cause. But acknowledging your shadow gives you the chance to change, to refine yourself, to become stronger and more conscious. It doesn't erase the fact that you will still be the villain in some dark stories, but it ensures that you won't remain the villain in your own. Right? So the challenge is this: stop running from the darker parts of yourself. Look at them, name them, understand them, because until you do, they will run your life from the shadows. And once you do, you have the power to turn them into strength. The truth is simple. We are not purely good and we are not purely bad. We are both. The question is whether we have the courage to admit it. Because only then can we stop being prisoners of our shadow and start becoming responsible stewards of our own lives.
One of the most exhausting traps we fall into is the pursuit of universal approval. It sounds noble on the surface, wanting to be liked, wanting to be fair, wanting to avoid being cast as the bad one. But beneath that is often something much darker. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being seen for who you truly are. And the paradox is that the harder you try to win everyone's approval, the more you lose yourself in the process. You see this everywhere. People bend over backwards to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, to smooth over differences. They hide their opinions because they don't want to offend. They say yes when they mean no. They pretend to be neutral when they feel strongly. They tolerate situations that erode their dignity, just so others won't label them as difficult. And for a while it works. You maintain the appearance of peace. You avoid obvious conflict. You even get praised for being so easy to get along with, but underneath you are fracturing. Every time you betray your own convictions for the sake of approval, you carve out a little piece of your soul and hand it over. And the irony is that no matter how hard you try, you will still end up being the villain in someone's story. You can be the kindest, most careful person in the room, and someone will still interpret you as arrogant or cold or insincere. Why? Because people don't see you as you are. They see you as they are. They filter you through their wounds, their history, their insecurities. You might remind them of someone who hurt them. You might represent values they despise. You might simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And suddenly, in their eyes, you are the antagonist. Right? So if you're destined to be misunderstood anyway, why sacrifice your authenticity in the desperate hope of avoiding it? Why betray yourself when the outcome is already inevitable? This is where courage comes into play. To live authentically is to accept the inevitability of disapproval. It's to recognize that your responsibility is not to maintain a spotless reputation in everyone else's narrative, but to live honestly in your own. And that requires boundaries. Boundaries are what separate those who are enslaved to approval from those who are truly free. Saying no when it matters. Speaking truth when it's uncomfortable. Standing firm in your principles, even when it costs you the affection of others. That's not arrogance, that's integrity. Integrity always has a price. But the price of integrity is far less devastating than the price of self-betrayal. Think about it. People who spend their lives chasing approval often end up resentful, bitter, and exhausted. They feel used, taken advantage of, unseen, and in a way they are right. Because when you hide your true self behind a mask of agreeableness, no one ever really sees you. They see only the mask. They love the version of you that exists for their comfort, not the real version of you that exists for truth. And that kind of love, if we're being honest, is worthless. It doesn't nourish you, it suffocates you. So the task becomes choose carefully whose approval you actually need. You don't need everyone to like you. You don't even need most people to like you. What you need is a few people whose respect is grounded in truth. People who know your flaws, who've seen your shadow, and who choose to value you anyway. That kind of respect is earned not by being agreeable, but by being authentic. And here's the deeper reality. People may dislike you for being truthful, but they will despise you for being fake. At least when you stand by your convictions, even if you're disliked, you remain solid. You know where you stand, but when you contort yourself into endless shapes to be liked, people sense the inauthenticity. They might smile at you, but they won't trust you. And without trust, approval is meaningless. Now, I don't mean you should go out of your way to be abrasive or that other people's opinions don't matter at all. We live in a social world, relationships are vital, but there's a difference between being considerate and being enslaved. Consideration says, I respect your perspective, but I won't betray mine. Enslavement says, I'll erase myself so you'll accept me. One builds dignity, the other erodes it. And this is where the philosophical depth comes in. If you live only for approval, you aren't really living. You've outsourced your sense of worth to the ever-shifting judgments of others, and those judgments are fickle. Today they love you, tomorrow they despise you, and you can do almost nothing to control that. So you become like a leaf in the wind, blown around by forces outside yourself. But if you anchor yourself in truth, in responsibility, in authenticity, then even when disapproval comes, you remain grounded. Now this connects back directly to the earlier points. Yes, perspective guarantees that you will be bad in someone's story. Yes, your shadow means that sometimes you actually will cause harm. But compounding both of those realities with the desperate chase for not universal approval is like putting chains on your own soul. You cannot escape being misunderstood. So the only rational path is to stop trying. Free yourself from the impossible burden of pleasing everyone and instead aim to become someone you yourself can respect, because that is the one approval you truly cannot live without. So the danger of seeking universal approval isn't just that it's impossible, it's that it destroys you in the process. And the antidote is simple, though not easy. Live authentically, accept the inevitability of criticism, and ground your life not in the praise of others, but in the truth of your own integrity. The truth is this: when you stop trying to be liked by everyone, you finally become someone worth respecting. There's something very fragile about reputation. It looks powerful on the surface. People's respect, their admiration, the way your name is spoken in a room. But in truth, it's one of the most unstable things you can ever build your life on. One rumor, one misunderstanding, one shift in cultural mood, and the reputation you spent years carefully crafting can collapse in a moment. If your entire sense of worth is tied to that, then you're building a life on sand. And when the waves of disapproval come, and they always come, you'll find yourself swept away. Responsibility, however, is different. Responsibility doesn't depend on what others say about you. It doesn't vanish when people turn against you, and it doesn't collapse when the crowd grows hostile. It is inward. It is the discipline of carrying the weight of your own existence and orienting your life toward truth and meaning, regardless of what anyone else thinks. And when the storm of judgment comes, responsibility keeps you rooted because it gives you something far deeper than reputation, to integrity. This is where the distinction matters. Reputation is about perception. Responsibility is about reality. Reputation says, what do others think I am? Responsibility says, who am I when no one is looking? And those are not the same question. In fact, they often pull in opposite directions. Sometimes the responsible thing to do, the thing aligned with truth, will tarnish your reputation. You may be called arrogant, selfish, even cruel, when in fact you are simply refusing to betray your values. Other times, maintaining a good reputation requires you to act against your conscience, to say the right things, to avoid rocking the boat, to be pleasing, even when you know it's dishonest. And in that moment, you face a choice. Will you protect your reputation, or will you honor your responsibility? This is not a trivial choice. Entire lives are shaped by it. There are people who, from a young age, learn that their worth comes from being admired. They chase reputation their whole lives, and they succeed to some degree. They appear polished, respected, even envied. But deep down, there's a hollowness. They've built a life that looks good from the outside, but feels empty on the inside. And when that reputation inevitably cracks, when people see their flaws, or when the cultural tide shifts, they are left with nothing solid to stand on. On the other hand, there are those who prioritize responsibility over reputation. They may not always be well liked. They may be called difficult, uncompromising, even offensive at times. But their lives have substance. They carry themselves with a kind of weight, a gravity that comes from living in alignment with truth. And even if people criticize them, there's often a grudging respect underneath it. Because deep down, people recognize the courage it takes to live that way. And this is where the earlier points tie together. If perspective ensures that you'll be bad in someone's story, and if your shadow ensures that you carry within you the potential to cause harm, then reputation comes, it will never give you stability because it's shaped by forces outside your control. But responsibility, owning your flaws, owning your choices, taking on the burden of becoming someone better, that is something you can control. And it gives your life a solidity that no external approval can match. The question then is this: what do you actually want to leave behind? Do you want to be remembered as someone who kept a spotless reputation, or as someone who carried their responsibility? It tends to remember the latter. The men and women who shaped the world were rarely beloved in their own time. They were criticized, mocked, and often despised. But they were responsible. They carried truth even when it cost them reputation. And in the long arc of history, that responsibility gave them a legacy that shallow popularity never could. And this applies not just on the grand stage of history, but in the ordinary fabric of your daily life, in your relationships, your work, your family. Are you choosing to protect your image, or are you choosing to act responsibly? Because reputation will tell you to say what's easy, to do what makes you look good. Responsibility will tell you to say what's true, to do what's necessary, even if it's unpopular. And if you want to live a life of meaning, you have to make peace with the fact that responsibility will sometimes cost you reputation. But here's the paradox. When you live responsibly, over time, you actually build the only kind of reputation that matters. Not the fragile reputation of public opinion, but the enduring reputation of character. People may dislike you in the moment, but as time passes, integrity reveals itself. People come to see that you were consistent, that you didn't sell out your values, that you stood firm when it mattered. Kind of respect is slow to build, but once it's there, it's almost impossible to destroy. So the choice before you is stark but liberating: reputation or responsibility. One enslaves you to the opinions of others, the other anchors you in truth. One leaves you fragile, at the mercy of every whisper, the other makes you solid, able to withstand the inevitable storms of judgment. You cannot have both all the time, and when the two collide, responsibility must come first. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with yourself. Long after the crowd has moved on, long after your reputation has faded, you'll be left with the question, did I live truthfully? Truthfully. Did I carry my share of responsibility, even when it cost me? If the answer is yes, then you've lived a life worth living, regardless of how many people approved along the way. So don't waste your energy polishing your image for everyone else's comfort. Instead, shoulder your responsibility. Live in truth and let your reputation rise and fall as it will. Because in the final analysis, responsibility builds a legacy, reputation builds a mask, and masks always break. The truth is this: if you want a life that stands firm when everything else collapses, choose responsibility over reputation. Every single time